September 18th, 1931, Munich apartment, 9:47 p.m. Adolf Hitler drops the telephone receiver. His niece, Geli Raubal, is missing. The door was locked from the outside. Her silver cigarette case sits on the hallway table, cigarettes untouched. Within minutes, SA brownshirts mobilize across Munich. A police captain arrives, sees Hitler's face, and steps back. The apartment shows no forced entry. Her coat hangs in the closet. Her purse rests on the bed. One window cracked open from inside. Hitler picks up the cigarette case, engraved GR, closes it, slides it into his pocket. A neighbor later said, "I've never seen him look like that. Where did she go? What did he unleash in the next 6 hours?" By dawn, 3 families would be interrogated. 1 man would be beaten. And Germany would never know the truth about what happened in that apartment. Subscribe, because what he did next rewrote his path to power. Geli Raubal moved into Adolf Hitler's Prinzregentenplatz apartment in Munich in 1929. She was 21. He was 40, her mother's half-brother, a rising figure in German politics. To the public, it looked like family care, an uncle providing for his niece. To anyone inside that apartment, it was something else entirely. Hitler controlled where she went, who she saw, what she wore. He bought her expensive clothes, jewelry, that silver cigarette case with her initials engraved. Every gift was a chain. She wanted to study music in Vienna. He refused. She wanted friends outside the Nazi Party circle. He interrogated her about them. Household staff heard the arguments. Party members saw the tension. One visitor recalled, "She seemed like a bird in a gilded cage." Her room was comfortable, thick carpet, fine furniture, a view of Munich. But the doors were often locked from the outside. By September 1931, she'd been living this way for 2 years. Something was about to break. The morning of September 18th started with an argument. Hitler was preparing for a trip to Nuremberg that afternoon. Geli wanted to go to Vienna. Again. The housekeeper, Anna Winter, heard raised voices from the hallway. "You're not leaving," Hitler said. The door to Geli's room slammed. Around noon, the apartment went quiet. Geli left the silver cigarette case on the hallway table. Hitler saw it there before he left around 2 p.m. He paused, picked it up, set it back down. He departed for Nuremberg with Rudolf Hess. The apartment was silent. Staff saw Geli in her room around 3 p.m. By 9 that evening, Hitler received a phone call. Geli was dead, not kidnapped. Dead. A gunshot wound to the chest. His Walther pistol on the floor beside her. But in the first frantic hours, he told everyone it was an abduction. That's the story he ran with. For 6 hours, he mobilized a search for kidnappers who didn't exist. Why? Because those 6 hours bought him time to bury the truth. At 9:47 p.m., Hitler's phone rang in Nuremberg. Rudolf Hess answered, listened, went pale. Hitler took the receiver. Within minutes, they were racing back to Munich. The drive took 3 hours, but the 6 hours that mattered had already started. In the first hour, Hitler believed, or claimed to believe, that Geli had been kidnapped. He called party officials. He activated SA brownshirts across the city. "Find her," he said. "Find who took her." 50 men deployed to search neighborhoods, cafes, train stations. A police captain was pressured to treat it as an abduction. The second hour, more calls, more deployment. The apartment was examined. No signs of forced entry. The window cracked from inside, her belongings untouched. Whispers started among the inner circle. By the third hour, the truth was undeniable, self-inflicted, his gun. But the machinery was already in motion, and Hitler made a choice: control the narrative or let scandal destroy his political future. He kept the cigarette case in his pocket through every meeting, every phone call, every decision. By dawn, the search for kidnappers had become a search for silence. Here's the first twist: there was no kidnapping. Geli Raubal shot herself in Hitler's apartment with his pistol while he was traveling to Nuremberg. The evidence was clear from the start, but Hitler acted as if she'd been abducted. Why? Because those 6 frantic hours gave him control over the story before it could spread. SA men were dispatched across Munich to interrogate Geli's friends about suspicious contacts. They wanted names. They wanted someone to blame. One man was pulled from his home and beaten: Emil Maurice, a former SS driver who had courted Geli 2 years earlier. Hitler had forced them apart back then. Now Maurice was a convenient suspect. Police were forced to investigate an abduction, even as the forensic evidence pointed to suicide. The housekeeper, Anna Winter, who had heard the argument that morning, was threatened into silence. Later, she told a friend, they were looking for someone to blame, anyone but him. The cigarette case stayed in Hitler's coat pocket during meetings with party officials. He clutched it while giving orders. The search served a purpose. It created confusion. It delayed the media. It intimidated anyone who might criticize. By the time newspapers were ready to report, the official story was already being shaped. Geli's death would not be an abduction. But those 6 hours of manufactured panic bought time. Time to clean the apartment. Time to threaten witnesses. Time to craft a version of events that wouldn't destroy Adolf Hitler's political career. The search wasn't about finding Geli. It was about controlling what Germany would believe happened to her. Rudolf Hess, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring were activated within hours. Their task: shape the story before newspapers could print the truth. Goebbels wrote in his diary later, "We must protect the Führer from scandal." The first version they crafted, tragic accident while cleaning a gun. It didn't hold. Geli had no reason to be handling Hitler's pistol. The second version, an intruder, a break-in gone wrong. That collapsed immediately. No forced entry. No missing valuables. The third and final version emerged by dawn. Geli was despondent over an unrequited love affair with someone else. She took her own life in a moment of despair. This version had just enough plausibility. It shifted attention away from Hitler's control over her life. Each version was workshopped during those 6 hours between panic and damage control. One party member later recalled, he wouldn't accept that she chose to leave him. Even in death, he needed another reason. This was the machinery of Nazi propaganda before the Nazis held power. Crisis management through intimidation, revision, and controlled narrative. The group worked through the night. Phone calls were made to sympathetic journalists. Editors were warned about printing speculation. Witnesses were located and instructed on what to say or not say. The cigarette case remained with Hitler, an object he'd given her, now a reminder of everything he'd lost control over. By morning, the official story was set. Tragic suicide, personal despair, Nothing to do with the locked doors, the arguments, the years of isolation. Germany would hear a simple, sad story. The machinery had worked, and it would work again. The evidence problem was straightforward. The gun was Hitler's Walter 635, registered in his name. The bullet trajectory indicated close range. Self-inflicted. There was no forced entry. The door had been locked from the inside. Forensic reality pointed to one conclusion, but political necessity demanded another. The medical examiner was visited by party officials. The pressure was clear. Rule the death ambiguous. Leave room for interpretation. The official police report was rewritten 3 times that night. The first version documented the argument that morning. It was revised. The second version noted the locked door. Hitler's gun. It was revised again. The third version focused on Geli's emotional state and removed specific details about control and confinement. Witnesses to the morning argument suddenly remembered nothing. Anna Winter, the housekeeper, gave a statement that contradicted what neighbors had heard. She later admitted she'd been told her pension depended on cooperation. Emile Maurice, the former driver, was arrested on unrelated charges and held for 48 hours. He wasn't charged. He wasn't questioned about Geli. He was simply removed from circulation during the critical first days. Every lead that might have pointed to a kidnapper dead-ended at the truth. This was suicide, and the truth was incompatible with Hitler's political survival. The cigarette case stayed in his pocket, a physical reminder of what he'd controlled and what he'd lost. Forensic investigators knew. Police knew. Staff knew. But knowledge without power is just knowledge. The Nazi Party had the power. And in 6 hours, they demonstrated how to wield it. The evidence told one story. Germany would hear another. Here's what they found during the apartment search. Letters, hidden in Geli's room, tucked into a book. Correspondence with a voice teacher in Vienna. She'd been planning an escape for weeks. She'd been accepted to the Vienna Music Academy, secretly. The letters detailed her plans. When she'd leave, where she'd stay, how she'd support herself. Hitler discovered these letters during those 6 hours. His rage wasn't just about her death. It was about her hidden plans. She'd been building a life he knew nothing about. That was the real betrayal in his mind. During that first night, SA men visited Vienna. They tracked down the voice teacher. They interviewed Geli's contacts there under the guise of routine questions about her state of mind. The music teacher later told a journalist, she seemed desperate to leave Munich, desperate to have her own life. Those interviews served 2 purposes: gather information about how far her plans had gone and intimidate anyone who might speak publicly about Hitler's control over her. The ordinary key was this: her desire for a normal life was the conspiracy Hitler had been searching for. There was no kidnapper. There was no intruder. There was just a 23-year-old woman who wanted to study music in Vienna and live without surveillance. That's what he couldn't accept. The letters were confiscated. They wouldn't surface publicly for decades. By the time they did, the official story was set in stone. But in those 6 hours, Hitler realized something. His control had already been broken before her death. She'd been planning to leave. The cage had failed, and he couldn't tolerate that Germany might know it. Heinrich Hoffmann entered the story around midnight. Hoffmann was Hitler's personal photographer, a man who understood the value of controlled images. His role during those 6 hours document the approved version of events. He photographed the apartment carefully, certain angles, certain rooms. Evidence was moved before the camera clicked. Items that suggested struggle or control were removed. The images Hoffman captured that night were never published, but they existed. They were leverage, insurance, proof that the official story had been staged. Hoffman later told an associate, "I photographed what he needed remembered, and I didn't photograph what needed to be forgotten." Other photographs were destroyed that night. Images that showed damaged furniture from arguments. Papers that documented Geli's restricted life. Anything that contradicted the narrative of the caring uncle and the tragically depressed niece. The bargain between Hitler and Hoffmann was implicit. Hoffmann's loyalty, his silence, his cooperation in managing the crisis would be rewarded. And it was. Hoffmann became the exclusive photographer of Hitler's rise to power. Every official image of the Führer from 1933 onward came through Hoffmann's lens. The reward for knowing how to bury a story was control over every story that followed. This was the pattern emerging from that night. Crisis managed through calculated intimidation, strategic documentation, and mutual complicity. Hoffmann knew the truth. Hitler knew that Hoffmann knew, and that shared knowledge became a bond. By dawn, the photographs were stored. The camera was packed. Hoffmann left the apartment with a nod. The second player had entered the story, and his role would extend far beyond one night in September 1931. September 19th, dawn. The official story crystallized as sunlight hit Munich. Newspapers across Germany received a prepared statement. Geli Raubal, niece of Adolf Hitler, died by suicide in a moment of personal despair. Cause listed, despondency over private matters unrelated to her uncle. No mention of arguments. No mention of locked doors or Vienna plans or years of control. Hitler's apartment was cleaned by loyalists. Evidence minimized. The cigarette case was still in his pocket during the first police interviews. A new problem emerged: Catholic burial. Suicide meant no church cemetery. But Hitler needed a proper funeral to maintain the image of the grieving uncle. A priest in Vienna was pressured. The details of that pressure were never recorded. But the result was clear. Geli would be buried in Vienna Central Cemetery with church approval. One reporter, a young journalist from a Munich paper, started asking questions about timeline inconsistencies. How long was Hitler away? Who was in the apartment? What did the housekeeper hear? He was visited by party officials that afternoon. His editor received a call. The questions stopped. The journalist was reassigned. By evening of September 19th, the story was locked. Tragic suicide, private despair, a nation mourned, and no one in Germany's press dared to ask what really happened in those 6 hours. September 23rd, 1931. Vienna Central Cemetery. Adolf Hitler stood as chief mourner at Geli Raubal's funeral. He wore black. His face was pale. Photographers captured the image of a devastated uncle. SA guards surrounded the ceremony, preventing independent journalists from getting close. Family members attended in silence. Geli's mother, Angela, Hitler's half-sister, stood apart from him. She knew. but she said nothing. Fear or loyalty or both. The silver cigarette case was no longer in Hitler's pocket. He'd brought it to the cemetery. Witnesses later reported that during a private moment before the coffin was closed, Hitler bent down, placed something inside, and whispered. What he said was never recorded. Speculation ranged from apology to claim, but the object was confirmed. The cigarette case with GR engraved on the lid. He'd given it to her in life. Now he buried it with her in death. The logistics of those 6 hours became clear in retrospect. Panic transformed into control, crisis into narrative, truth into legend. 4 days from death to burial. 4 days to rewrite history. The coffin closed. The earth covered it. And with it, the cigarette case, the arguments, the locked doors. And the real story of what happened in Munich. Germany moved on. Hitler's political rise continued. Weeks passed. The story held. Emil Maurice was released from custody. He never spoke publicly about Geli Raubal. Friends said he was warned, silence or consequences. He chose silence. Anna Winter, the housekeeper, moved to a different city with a pension. She was comfortable. She was quiet. Police reports from September 18th were sealed. They wouldn't be opened for decades. When they finally were, the revisions were obvious. 3 different versions, each softer than the last. Hitler responded to remaining press questions with lawsuits. One newspaper editor in Berlin printed an article titled Mysterious Circumstances in Munich. He was forced to print a retraction the following week. His paper nearly lost its license. The Nazi Party grew stronger through 1932. Hitler's show of control during the crisis became a model. Truth was what the machinery said it was. Opposition was crushed through intimidation. Loyalty was rewarded. The cigarette case became a legend among the inner circle. People close to Hitler mentioned it in private. The object he'd carried for hours, the symbol of the control lost, the gift buried with his niece. It represented something to those who knew. What he'd controlled, what he'd lost, and what he was willing to do to bury the truth. The machinery worked, and it would work again, on a much larger scale. The immediate cost: 3 families interrogated, 1 man beaten, witnesses silenced. Truth buried. Medium term, Hitler's need for control intensified. He kept Geli's room in the Munich apartment unchanged for years. Visitors reported that he'd stare at her portrait during meetings. He never mentioned her name publicly after 1932, but he had a duplicate cigarette case made. Same silver, same engraving, GR. He carried it for the rest of his life. The political lesson, crisis management through intimidation, worked. It became the blueprint. Control the story. Control reality. Threaten opposition into silence. Reward loyalty with power. What broke in Hitler that September night never repaired. Associates noticed the change. He became colder, more paranoid, more absolute in his demands for obedience. Those 6 hours taught him something. Truth was negotiable if you had enough power to negotiate it. April 1945, Berlin. The bunker. Hitler's final days. Among his personal possessions, Soviet forces found a silver cigarette case. Engraved GR. He'd carried it for 14 years, from September 1931 to April 1945. Through the rise to power, through war, through collapse, staff testimony confirmed he held it during final meetings in the bunker. The object survived the man. The cigarette case found in rubble, initials still visible. Full circle. From panic in Munich to defeat in Berlin. What he did in 6 hours in 1931 showed Germany how he'd rule. Bury truth, intimidate opposition, control the narrative. 3 families, 1 young woman, countless lives touched by the machinery he built that night. An ordinary object, extraordinary weight. The legend was control. The truth was buried in silver and loss. And Germany learned what happens when power decides reality.